Hi gang, welcome back. We're talking about global trade after 1500 today. Here are the standards that you're going to be talking about and learning about. You guys have already started describing the location and development of the Ottoman Empire, describing India, the Mughal Empire, and the nature of its coastal trade. You're already looking at East Asia, including China and the Japanese shogunate. And we've already talked a little bit about Africa and how it became increasingly important in global trade. So today we're going to talk about two really important concepts that are really vital to understanding why European countries went around the world and did all the things they did, and that's the commercial revolution, and that's also mercantilism. So let's, before we get too much further, let's go ahead and talk about the commercial revolution. So the time period, obviously, we're talking about is sometime between 1520 and 1650. Prior to even the age of exploration, even during the age of exploration, the motivation to go to other countries was really monetary. They really wanted to gain money. The people were seeking to gain money, and so they started doing that, looking for spices. Well, what they eventually figured out, as more and more countries did this, is that led to an increase in competition. So this competition was twofold. One, it was a competition for markets. And what I mean by markets is a place for the mother countries, those countries sending out people to colonize, to sell their stuff. And also a simple competition for money. A competition to gather as much money as possible. Okay, so that's part number one in what happened. Increased competition for markets, places to sell your stuff. And two, increased competition for money, actual monetary value, gold, for example. Secondly, second thing was that business was changing. What eventually, and we'll talk about this in a second, but what people started figuring out is no longer were they content making a little bit of money and being the richest in their area. They wanted to gain more money. And they figured out that in order to gain the most money possible, they really had to combine their wealth. And something we're going to talk about in just a little bit is how they combine their wealth. So the commercial revolution had two kind of facets or causes. One, competition for markets, places to sell your stuff, and money. People wanted to gather money. And two, businesses were changing. Companies began to grow. There was a little bit of what we'll call capitalism, and that's free trade. Just a very little bit of where individual people and companies were allowed to gain money and spend it on their own. Second thing, a facet of this, or another facet of this, was standardization of money. During the Renaissance, the Italian city-states obviously were very wealthy, and so one of the things that happened was their money, okay, in Florence they used something called the florin, and Venice they used something called the ducat. Their coins, their actual coins, became the standard traded unit of money around Europe. The reason it became standardized means every place in Europe used that money. The reason it became standardized is because everyone knew that the ducat and the florin had value. Everyone put their faith in it. We have the dollar in America because people have faith that that dollar has value. That's why it's very important, is that it does have value because we have faith in it. Okay, so one, standardization of money. Everyone began using the same money. And even within countries, people began using their own individual money. For example, in Britain, they had the pound. Eventually, in America, they would use the pound, and then we would evolve into the dollar. And so France had francs, etc. You get the point that standardization of money, everybody used the same money, played a really important role in that. So another facet was that led to the commercial revolution is that in order to pay for all these long-distance voyages, people had to have a way to make money and to gather money, because these voyages were really expensive. And so kings and queens were obviously the number one place where people started because they were wealthy. They had a lot of land. They had a lot of gold. You go to them for help. Well, what they eventually found out is that even kings and queens didn't have enough money to finance everything. So what we notice is that banks began to grow. Again, if you'll think back to the Reformation and the Renaissance, banking begins to blow up, especially in Italy. the usury is no longer seen as a sin, so you can make loans to people and expect to make money off of the loan that you gave them. And secondly, we see something called the growth of a joint stock company. Joint stock companies are the forefather, okay, the early version of today's modern stock companies. Today we've got Apple, we've got IBM, we've got Google is a joint stock company. These companies all say, hey, everybody, we want to make some money, but we need some help making money, and we want to make a new product. So they go out and they ask a bunch of people for some money to put all their money in a pot. And what they're going to do is everybody puts their money in a pot, and then you have more money. Now, what's the benefit of that? If that company, Facebook, Google, Apple, whoever, if that company makes more money, you get a portion of that. So if I buy stock in Apple, all right, if I buy stock in Apple at $5 a share, for example, $5 a piece, and I buy one piece of it, every time Apple makes a profit, I get a percentage of their profit. It may not be very big, but that's an investment. So the early version of these stock companies, for example, the early version of these stock companies are places like the Dutch East India Company. You need to know the Dutch East India Company. You need to know the British East India Company. They were companies that tried to make money, okay, by pooling people's resources, by gathering money from a bunch of different people and saying, hey, we've got a plan. We're going to go out as a business. We're going to get wealth, and you're going to get a piece of the pie because you're helping us raise money for this. The Jamestown Colony was started as a joint stock company. All right, joint stock company was very important to that. So let's review real quick. The commercial revolution had a couple of parts. One, it occurred between 1520 and 1650. It occurred and was able to take place because there was an increased competition for markets, places to sell things, and increased competition for money among European countries. Two, business was no longer done the standard old small business way. Companies began to grow and get larger. Another reason, money was now standardized. In particular, the florin and the ducat, florin from Florence, Italy, and the ducat from Venice, Italy, I believe, were very important in the development of wealth. People accepted them because they had value and they knew they had value. They put faith in them. Secondly, in order to pay for these long voyages in the age of exploration, banks were growing because they were able to make more loans because the Reformation ended usury as a sin. Loaning money for a profit was no longer a sin according to the Catholic Church, and it became accepted societal practice. Lastly but not leastly, joint stock companies began to form. People got together, threw their money in a pot, said, hey, we're going to help finance this journey to Jamestown, to the New World, to buy tea, to do whatever, and we're going to make some money off of this, and we're going to get a little bit of a piece of the pie based on this. Those joint stock companies were the early version of today's modern companies that we have today that open and go for sale in public and are traded on the New York Stock Exchange. All right, so that's the commercial revolution in about 5 or 6 minutes. Check back tomorrow for the next video on mercantilism.